Hello friends, we've already started the program titled the English essay last time, and today is the second series, the second version of it, and we have with us Dr. Richa Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, University of Delhi, and she has worked on the contemporary aspects of literature and theory, and she'll be there to explain a few things for our benefit. The English essay, as we introduced it last time, and the introduction is going to continue for another 2 or 3 months, because everybody would like to find out the meaning of, the implications of, the dimensions that this particular term, the English essay, requires. And for instance, I would like to ask Dr. Bajaj today itself one or two questions regarding the English essay, which originated, as he said in the last lecture, in the 18th century. And 18th century is, Dr. Richa Bajaj, different from the 17th century in so many senses. For instance, till the 17th century you have a monarch, you have a court, that court is taken seriously. But when it comes to the 18th century, then the same court becomes a kind of a model which is supposed to be visited sometime but never taken seriously. It's always the masses, the street, the market, the commercialism that is there in England at that time, and people are getting more and more involved in the making of economy, in the making of the country. And if they are involved in the making of the country, then they require their own voice also in literature. And perhaps for that reason, the understanding of the phenomena of commercialism in the 18th century will help us a great deal in understanding what the English essay is. This is my first question. I hope you would agree with me, or at least explain to me your point of view regarding this. The second thing that I talk of is that the common person as an individual is at the center of the English essay. The common person can be a woman, it can be a man, it can be a fashionable person, it can be a person from the village, it can be a person from the town, from the city, and they are moving around and they are looking at the world, and the common person, the common individual is at the center of the English essay. So two things: one, that it's the time of the merchant, rise of the merchant class, and the second thing that is that the center of attraction for the English essay is the voice of the individual at that time, and that individual is a common person. So please explain to me, for my benefit, the two things that you also might hold important.
Yeah, thank you for raising two very important questions, Professor Prakash, and I'm glad we are beginning on this note, in fact, because in my view, the two questions are interrelated. In many ways, when we speak of the 18th century trend and how there is a there is a remarkable shift that you see in literary sensibility also, and also the culture of the time, there is a shift from monarchy. Even when the monarchy is restored in 1660, it is never really properly restored, in the sense that you cannot bring the past back. You cannot, you can bring back, restore monarchy, but can you bring back that time, that kind of an age, that culture? I don't think that was the case, and which is why it became a stock for comedy also. Very soon you found that this was more vulgar, and this kind of restoration comedy also, did not think much of morals, and they had nothing really to offer to England. And post this period, you enter the phase of the making of England, or English culture, I would say. It's a very interesting era, because I think it is when England becomes conscious of its new dynamic, in the sense of new class dynamic that it has, and which is why it's not the court that is more important but the parliament. And it is obviously, I think it has relevance. We need to understand that both Addison and Steele, the two people we attribute all the credit for the English essay, both of them were members of the parliament, right? And they belonged to a club called the Kit Kat Club at the time. In fact, that's where they brainstormed their ideas. Of course, the Kit Kat Club was flourished from about 1696 to about 1720, and this is the period where it's taken from the mutton pie maker Christopher Cat, right? So now these aristocratic people, they met, this was even later Johnson joined this group, and Congreve was a part of this group. So basically these are Whig supporters also. And Addison, who I will be discussing in today's lecture, Joseph Addison, he was a Whig supporter. And he understood really early. He understood in his own in his growing up years. I'm sure this is what went into the mental makeup of the man. Also, he understood that for England to prosper, it was important for England to have wealth. And for England to have wealth, it had to have a strong commercial base, right? Commerce had to be strengthened, and commerce could only be strengthened when there was free trade allowed, when the parliament passed laws that gave strength to the merchant class. As you say, in the era of commercialism and new power dynamics shaping England at the time, it became clear also, you see, towards this end of the 17th century that England had to depend on the mercantile group, and that it could no more sustain itself on the monarchy, because there was no money and the treasury would be emptied if it were not the merchants who were supporting England. So I think as far as society is concerned, your first question, that is to do with commercial activities and the redundancy of the parliament, redundancy of the monarchy and the supremacy of the parliament, has a lot to do with the shaping of the English culture in the 18th century or towards the end of the 17th century, which is clearly moving away from old classical styles and moving in the direction of more common speech. And which is why I say that your second question is related to the first, because the parliament consists of this varied group, right? And it's obviously it's got to do with people who have become, who have important positions. They hold important positions, but at the same time they have direct link with the life of the street. And coffee houses, a circuit becomes, this kind of coffee houses, chocolate houses, or these streets, they become the centers of discussion, and an intellectual life is being created in England at the time. You could also say it is because of the the printing press that came into being, and circulation of literature, magazines, newspapers. Newspapers were coming from abroad, from Europe, ships. Now it's very interesting that these were basically trading ships, but these ships also carried newspapers from other European countries. So interest in other European countries, and so I think there is a sense of intellectual culture that is getting built, and common people are interested in now ideas. They are interested in what's going on in England, what's going on in Poland, how are the what's the reaction of this military head or that. So I think common people on the street are also equally interested in politics, in military, in affairs of economics, which is a new tendency in England. And that's where I think they come to the center, because they associate themselves with this ascendant class of the bourgeois, you could say, or the ascendant middle class, of which they were very much a part. Even if they were in the lower rungs of society, even then they related better to this rising middle class than they did with an aristocracy that always claimed its claimed its place based on its blood, and where they and in a way created barriers. But with the trading class coming to the center and gaining that kind of power, they felt that there was a kind of a direct link with this class that they had. So I think the common people become in fact the subject of these essays. And in fact the language used also is, Addison particularly discards the classical language even when he uses quotes at the beginning of his essays, just as a kind of an epigrammatic statement. He is throughout using straight language. In fact, he is using a simpler language which is readable, which is interesting, so much so that people actually reproached Addison for bringing in a kind of Addisonian termination in his sentence, which meant that he would often leave his sentence with a preposition, which the English genteel group would not agree with. So in a way there is a reinvention of language, and based on the kind of demands of the people. So I think that's how I would like to answer your question.
You have used two very important words in your talk, and these two words are Whigs and Tories. Now, for the benefit of the young scholar, the undergraduate, for instance, or the early graduate of the postgraduate class, what exactly is Whig and what exactly is Tory? Because these two words, are very popular in discussion, and there were groups and they were all the time fighting in England. So, which were the Tory groups and which were the Whig groups? I mean, what is the standpoint of the Tories and the Whigs? If you could just say a few things.
Of course, one can go into the research and work on this, but just a kind of a basic trend that Tories would be supporters of the conservative group, right? And the Whigs were supporting the democratic ideal that was coming into shape, that came into being with the civil war and also the English Revolution. So, so there were these progressive groups who were more in favor of a dynamic democratic parliamentarian society, and they associated themselves with Whigs directly or indirectly. Most of these writers directly or indirectly supported these groups, but also there were conservatives who were pro-nobility, pro-monarchy, and they were then conservatives and they believed in hierarchies, etc. They went with the Tories.
And they clashed intellectually.
Yes, they clashed intellectually, but when it came to nationalism, they sort of came together. So I think the interest, what's interesting to note in this period is that the sense of nationalism is very strong. So much so that even groups, for instance, they're discussing whether the Protestants can win this battle against the Pope, etc. All these discussions are going ahead, but whatever their differences within themselves, I think they're very nationalistic in spirit and very patriotic, and they make sure that literature celebrates any nationalist win. So in fact, Addison was made to write a poem in praise of a war that England won at the time, and because it was appreciated, he also got a position in the government. So you can see that England requires these writers who assist them in the task of, I think, nationalism. And so, of course, that becomes the stock of, again, critique in some cases. For instance, Samuel Johnson would go on later and criticize the tendencies within nationalism that makes one blind. So I think, but England is nationalistic at this particular point. But what is, and when it is also trying to fashion its own self. For instance, from the end of the 17th century, you find that the periodical press offered commentary on aristocratic habits. Now, within aristocratic habits, they would offer a critique of, say, gambling, dueling, which they felt would be redundant, and gambling for sure, as something which would lead to the decline of the entire group. So, even when aristocracy is present, there is a new section in society. For instance, through the periodical press, these essayists are now in a position to offer a critique of aristocratic habits that they think would go against the grain of what they call England. So, gambling, dueling, swindling, these are the things that they would critique. At the same time, they critiqued fashion, of hair, face, this kind of coquetry that was prevalent in aristocracy, loose morals, for instance. These became, they developed a new kind of taste, and they offered a new guideline for writing and a sense of taste that could be now acquired in England, which would go against the previous aristocratic model and build a more rational, simpler and logical way of life. I think this is what they're all getting to. And of course, within the arts, they offered stylistics, they offered their critique on, not necessarily critique, but also a kind of a guideline or a model of how literature could be written, how essays could be written. So, artistic, theatrical, and also literary criticism, what were the basic principles of those? Even they were articulated, which is why I say that the building of in 18th century culture really happens through the English essay, according to me. And that's the basic statement I think I wanted to make regarding the English essay, that it is in the 18th century through the English essay that you see the making of an English culture, where there are guidelines provided on, principles provided on artistic work, on theatre, on literary criticism, on literary production houses, for instance, that were also bringing in circulation these periodicals, which becomes then the base for the Tatler and the Spectator, the two important magazines that we will be discussing today. Of course, I am going to take up Joseph Addison's a couple of essays from the Tatler, just to give you a sense of how what the English essay was. It had a light-hearted tone, etc. It was urban in wit. It had that urbane wit. So certainly it was urbane. We are not talking about rural landscape here. And within this urbane wit, we are also looking at intellectuals. But it's very interesting that Addison's, the writer becomes a sort of an observer also, and very much seems to hold a camera to society, because then he moves around and he captures people around him, and in that sense he meets people who are on the street, who are sitting on benches and discussing things, very much like how in India we have, at a street corner, a chai shop, a tea seller, and people gathering together and discussing politics, right? So it is that kind of a situation, or that kind of a phenomena, that you also witness in 18th century, where Addison, for instance, moves around and he sees around him these people sitting on a bench at the end of the road, and where they're all sitting together to discuss the news and what's going on, what is going to happen. They're making conjectures, of course, on the situation, etc. So I think it's got this kind of a very vibrant, dynamic feel about it. And even as the writer is an urbane wit, within quotes, he's supposed to be an intellectual, but the people that he's capturing, they are not necessarily those who belong to the coffee house culture. They are those who are walking down the streets, who are sitting in parks, and and he notes them and he writes about them. So I think it's not the subject is not limited to the coffee house culture, even as it might seem that to be the case. He takes that also, but then he moves around and talks about the life and that exists in London at the time. I think that's very important. And it's, would you agree with this?
I would definitely agree with this, and I would say that there seemed to be a division at that point of time in culture, and that division is along lines of the two following things that I would say. One is that there is a group in society at that time of royalists. You call them aristocrats, you call them orthodox people, you call them classical people, whatever. They are royalists and they are monarchists, and these people are on one side, and they are feeling threatened, and because of which they are pulling the leg of the other section, and the other section is of moderns. So moderns on one side, you call them progressives and democratic people, and the royalists on the other, and both are trying to assert their own cause, and that the stage is, as you rightly say, is the English essay.
But I would like to add a point here. The English essay set out not to push down an opinion. In fact, the writer said that their spirit lies in moderation and temperance, and which is why I feel the rational principle works supreme here. It is to talk about life, but not take a position. They are in fact just observing what they see around and making a slight comment on things. They are not necessarily, it is not in that sense argumentative like an essay, because English culture at the time, and in the as you mentioned very rightly, that there were stark divisions in society. It was actually trying to bridge the gap between the two, and it wasn't trying to join one group or another, because there was already so much of satire and clash and this kind of acerbic sort of humor exercise. Think of Alexander Pope and think of these people. They would criticize everyone right, left and center, so much so that as Pope actually in his letter to Arbuthnot, the poem I refer makes fun of Joseph Addison, calling him Atticus, where he says that he is willing to wound and yet afraid to strike, right? So I don't see it as a negative. While Pope portrays it as a negative statement that he is willing to wound and yet afraid to strike, I see it as temperance. I see it as moderation. He is deliberately not striking.
Why?
Because he wants to create space for discussion. He wants to create a space where both opinions and he's not trying to give his opinion and then push it as a kind of an agenda.
You mean
this is more like an open space.
This is an emphasis for moderation and temperance and tolerance
and
togetherness.
Exactly. There is more tolerance, because there is already so much clash in other fields in other strains of literature. The English essay takes it humorously and doesn't go towards derision or satire or pinning people down. You know, it's not that kind of
They are
satire.
building up a nation.
They are building up nation through humor and not satire. And I would like you to explain the difference between humor and satire.
Oh no, of course, humor is that way is very, I mean, it's indulgent, but when it comes to satire, then it's an attack. I mean, that's how I generally look at it.
Right.
But the point I'm making is that the other point that you are raising here is that India requires nationhood. England at that point of time requires nationhood, and for that, you know, different groups, you know, have to come together, even on the basis of discussion and on the basis of difference of opinion. So difference of opinion, discussion, but there is a platform, and that platform is the nation. It gives people freedom and it keeps them together.
Right.
And perhaps for that reason, English essay is helpful in understanding the 18th century culture of what is called Augustinism. There is the old Augustus now cannot be brought back from the classical period, but the new Augustan period is that where the nation is strong and nation itself is Augustan. How do you interpret this?
Yeah, so you know, the spirit of Augustinism
Yes.
is what they try to bring in, you know, because they try to get what they find is useful over there. Of course, they can't bring in, and they don't want to bring in classical hierarchies, but the spirit is something that they want to bring to 18th century life. Now, let me quote actually this cultural historian, John Brewer. He said about this English essay, and I'd like to quote and then maybe take your opinion on this. He says that the purpose of the English essay was, and I quote, to shape the arts by creating an elaborate web of influence and patronage, and by creating a sympathetic climate of opinion for writers it favored, unquote. Right. Now, I think it's to, for my reading of this again, is to shape the arts. That's the important thing. And the second important thing for me here is the sympathetic climate of opinion that they are trying to create, right? For writers that it favored also, right? So there is, of course, maybe an underlying agenda, but it is just, it's not a kind of a vociferous attack, right? So there is a sympathetic climate of opinion building and public shaping of public opinion as well at the time, which I find important, and the English essay does that job very well, according to me. What do you say?
Of course, the language has changed and wit is important now. And satire is there, but it's mild satire, and
Right.
there is heroic, but it's mock heroic. So people laugh at, you know, heroism. At the same time, they approve of heroism. So it's that kind of a mix of different ideas, different perspectives, and England is that way becoming a role model for most of the European societies, if not the rest of the world. And it's a kind of freedom to discuss and freedom to exchange views and yet remain together.
Right. So, you know, two things then. One, that it just avoids the zealous approach. It's not going into a zealous opinions as is there in other cases, nor is it a heavy researched philosophical inquiry into a subject. So it tries to avoid both these paths, and then takes the middle course where insights are offered on experiences, maybe practical information, etc. So I think it's to do with it takes this periodical essay, then takes this middle course between the two, and at the same time is very insightful because it shows it captures the eccentricities of the time. It captures there are pen portraits here. An individual comes up and that individual is recreated in the form of a character, and then this character begins to show certain proclivities. So I think you see in the character of England emerge through these essays, and which is why they are very literary in many ways. You know, they are not boring essays of the kind that you would expect any research, abstruse sort of research, but these are essays that actually give you an insight of what what was England like. And it's not a sociological inquiry, it is not a psychological inquiry, it is a very it's a kind of a pen portrait, right? And the pen portrait develops the character based on situations that one is a part of, and I think that's what it captures, the life of the time.
The essence of the 18th century essay is that one has to take it easy. One has not to take a position, one has not to have very violent clash of opinions, but then one feels togetherness, and one also feels at the same time the mood of gossip, the mood of banter, the mood of light attack on people and things like that. So friends, a very important general aspect of the English essay has been presented very comprehensively by Dr. Bajaj in the first part of the lecture, and as she has promised already, she will be then specifically talking about Joseph Addison, who was one of the main proponents of the genre of the essay in the 18th century. So for that, we move to the next part a little later. Thank you.